I made a kilogram and a half of pure MDMA for $4,000. So that was quite a deal. And
Dr. David E. Nichols, I've heard people refer to you as the greatest living psychedelic chemist. For the listener at home who isn't familiar with you and isn't familiar with your work, what's the most important context for them to understand that title and that incredible accolade?
well, I was a professor in the Purdue University School of Pharmacy for 38 years. I was very lucky to get that position. A bunch of lucky happenstances put me in that position. And I was also able to get grant money from both the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse to study MDMA, ecstasy, and also psychedelics. Psychedelics for most of my career. I synthesized a lot of novel psychedelics, um, and also made the MDMA that MAPS used for their phase 1 and 2 clinical studies. Also made the DMT that Rick Doblin used in his studies. Made the psilocybin that was used at Johns Hopkins, 20 grams of psilocybin for most of their studies. And and I also made some psilocybin for Bob Jesse for his study of psilocybin in normals that was published. In 1993, I was the founder of the Hefter Research Institute, and we raised money from philanthropists to fund clinical studies of psychedelics because there was no government money to do that. We raised $10 million, and we funded some of the earliest studies that were published, clinical studies, which really showed that it was possible to do this research. You just wouldn't get government money at the time. So really, we demonstrated the possibility of doing research on psychedelics. And now you have, I can't even keep track. I used to keep copies of all the papers that were published on psychedelics. I can't do it anymore. There's like 5,000 a year. I have like 5 or 6,000 in that file, and I just can't add many more. So it's really taken off. I think the attitudes about psychedelics have changed from when we started. Well, when we started Hefter Institute, we were going to study the utility of psychedelics. And we had some big names say, "Oh, don't use that word psychedelic. It's too trippy, hippie, you know. I mean, call them hallucinogens or something." And we said, no, they're not hallucinogens. They don't produce true hallucinations. Psychedelic is really the best word. And now I wrote review articles for some mainstream pharmacology journals. I wrote one in 2004 that was titled Hallucinogens. It's been highly cited. And then in 2000, later, I got an invitation from the editor of one of those major pharmacology journals asking me if I would write a review article on psychedelics. And I took that as the sign that it was okay. So that article published in 2016 is called Psychedelics. It's been cited thousands of times. Anytime you read a paper on psychedelics, there often is a citation in that paper. So it's gotten cited thousands of times. So, and if you wanted to know anything about psychedelics in earlier years, you'd get me to come and give a seminar because I was at Purdue University, a big time Midwestern university, Big Ten university. So they figured that I wasn't just full of crap, you know. So hey, get this guy Dave Nichols to come and give a seminar. So I give a seminar on psychedelics, and the room would be packed. I often had the seminar host coming up and saying, "We've never had that many people at one of our seminars before." So there was always a lot of interest, but just nobody was doing it. And I was just very fortunate to be in a position where I got money to do it. I was at a big name school, and so if Dave Nichols at Purdue did, it must be okay. It wasn't like I was at some little no-name school, you know, and who's this guy publishing crap? And I published in mainstream journals, you know, pharmacology and chemistry journals. And I trained, I think, 45 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. A lot of visiting scholars came from other countries. So I've had some influence on the field, I suspect.
It's the understatement of the year, I think, based on everything you've just said for the last 4 minutes. No, it's a true honor to have you on. You know, the podcast is called the Giant Shoulder. You are an absolute giant in the field of psychedelics. The 3 studies that you kind of glossed over quickly there, the Johns Hopkins psilocybin study, the MAPS MDMA, Rick Strassman's DMT. I mean, these are studies that you read about again and again in books. They are the most seminal landmark studies in this space. And you and your lab produce the drugs for all of them. Why is that? Are you really good at making drugs? Are you really good at getting licenses? What is that? Because that seems
No,
like a crazy thing for one person to be able to do.
the chemistry wasn't that difficult. Really the issue was reputation. So when Rick Doblin was starting MAPS, he thought he was going to do it himself. His parents were wealthy; they gave him a lot of money, and um, he I met him at in California years ago in 1985, 1986. Um, and I chatted with him, and he was then a student at New College in Florida. He was all full of himself, and he was going to make MDMA a legal drug and all that stuff. And I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. I just kind of, yeah, Rick, okay, well, good luck. But I said, you need to get a PhD, or nobody's going to take you seriously. And I don't know whether he did because I told him to, but he did get a PhD. And then he wrote to me sometime in spring of '85, I guess. Um, and said, you know, I can't afford to make an MDMA. I want to do clinical studies, but I have to do toxicology studies. And I've been checking around, and nobody will touch the synthesis of this for less than $150,000. And I just don't have that kind of money. And he said, could you make it? I said, sure. And so I recruited my students, and we made it for the cost of the materials. There was no overhead. We didn't say, "Oh yeah, this is worth a lot of money. You need to give us a bunch of money." I think I made a kilogram and a half of pure MDMA for $4,000. So that was quite a deal. And so they use that. You can use it for phase 1 and 2 clinical studies, but then when you do phase 3, you need it made under GMP conditions, good manufacturing practices lab. And then to do that, and that ended up costing several $100,000. I don't remember the exact figure. So $4,000 to allow him to start that program. We get and we made it. We had them in bottles, brown bottles that were sealed with paraffin of, I think, 200 or 250 grams each. I sent in the first bottle, and the toxicology company said, we don't need any more. That's plenty. So I had the rest of it in my safe. And so when anybody wanted it for scientific studies, if they were qualified, I'd just say, send me, there's a special form DEA 222 you have to use for transferring controlled substances. And by then, MDMA was Schedule 1. So I'd just send me your form 222 and I'll send it to you. And I did it gratis mostly. So a lot of the research that was done with MDMA, preclinical research and neurochemical research, was done with MDMA that we made way back in '85. We kept it in our safe, and it had to be reanalyzed periodically. And over 20 years, it had no degradation. So it was very stable, kept at room temperature in the brown bottle and sealed with paraffin. I think we may have blown the bottles out with nitrogen, but we showed that MDMA was stable as a solid crystalline form for more than 20 years.
Right? I mean, why do you think we're so damn slow on this?
I think it's mostly attitudes that were really, younger people are more open-minded. And some of the older people, I was in a program a couple weeks ago discussing developing money in one of the states for supporting research on psychedelics, moving them toward therapy. And there was an old psychiatrist there. I don't remember his name. I probably shouldn't say it even if I did. And after all this discussion, he said, well, we need more research. I'm thinking, how much more research do you need? I mean, drugs like chlorpromazine, from the time of discovery to being used, marketed, is like 2 years. Valium was like 2 or 3 years. These drugs hit the market very fast. Now it's more difficult today than it used to be, but these signals are strong enough, and I think it's slowly changing. The director of National Institute on Drug Abuse, Nora Volkow, she was opposed to these drugs, and now she's an advocate. So I think it's at the highest levels where you still have these, a bunch of hippies that want to take psychedelics, and but I think it's really mental attitudes more than anything, and that'll change. We're watching a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts. If this occurs, it's been since we published our Hefter studies, the first one in 2011. So it's been 10 years, 12 years. You know, how long does a paradigm shift change when psychiatry is the most conservative branch of government of medicine? And So how long does it take to implement a real paradigm change? Probably longer than 10 years. And that's probably fast. 20, 25 years. I think within the next 10 years, psilocybin will probably be approved fairly soon. Assuming they get the money to go back and do MDMA. That was a farcical thing. Um, there was one investigator, Richard Jensen, who had a sexual relationship with one of the patients in Canada, and that came to light. So everybody said, "Oh my God," Well, one person. I mean, that can happen. That doesn't mean the drug is no good. And then they said, well, because this drug had abuse potential, there was one of the scales of abuse potential that they didn't record. Like, did it produce, how much euphoria did it produce? Well, we all know that MDMA makes people feel really good. That's why they were taking it at rates. I've taken it before. It's a great drug. Well, we know that. What more proof do you need that it
Yeah.
has high abuse potential? So that's kind of, well, we can't improve because they didn't record abuse potential in their schedules, and because it's possible that someone could abuse. Psychiatrists have abused patients forever. They're vulnerable. So I think that'll come back. It's a question of how long it takes Lycos to generate another, however many $1 million it takes to do another phase 3 study. But it'll come back. But I think um, Compass and psilocybin, I think, is going to be approved maybe this year, later this year, and that'll be for depression. And once it's been approved for one thing, psychiatrists can use it off label. So if it's approved for depression, they can use it for. There's a study I know of obsessive compulsive disorder that's being done, a study that's being done of eating disorders, and psilocybin. If those studies work, if the doctor looks at that and says, "Oh, I have a patient with eating disorder. I think I can treat it with psilocybin assisted therapy." If it's been approved for anything, he can do it. It's at his own risk. If something goes wrong, and say, "Well, this wasn't an approved indication," but doctors have always used drugs off label for things that weren't initially approved. So I think once psilocybin is approved, we'll see it being used.
Think I think obviously mentality is a very large aspect, but if you look at the economic incentives, there's clearly a lot of very large institutions that would not benefit from psychedelics being legal and readily available, right? I mean, you can list, there's so many, but from big alcohol, big tobacco, and big pharma as just three, even not getting into anything really conspiratorial, you can kind of say as a fact that if psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca, all of these different things were well studied and available for use, then people are going to give up alcohol. They're going to give up smoking. They're going to be able to quit their addictions because that's what the best studies are showing. And if it's a really effective treatment for depression, I think about 10% of the revenue of big pharma is from SSRIs. Like that's going to go down. Like it's not a great thing that these very large institutions are incentivized for psychedelics to not become legal and not to become readily accessible. And again, I think that it'd be very easy to go put your conspiracy hat on and say that they're actively, lobbying against it, whatever. I don't think you have to even go that far. Just purely looking at the economic incentives, these are very large institutions that, do not want this revolution to happen. I mean, that's fair to say, right?
Yeah. Years ago, there was, and I don't know if it's true or not, but in the UK, that the alcohol industries were lobbying against legalization of MDMA because people going to parties and taking MDMA and they weren't drinking. And all these parties
Exactly.
where they were using MDMA, the alcohol consumption went way down. But with respect to therapy, I think you're always going to have people that want to drink and don't think they have a problem. And it's going to be the few people, well, I don't know what the percentage is, but the few people that can't control their drinking and want to stop. You have to want to stop, and you try to stop and you can't. Then these therapies are good. PTSD, of course, we have no good therapy for that, and it was ridiculous. One of the commenters on when the FDA rejected MDMA for PTSD said, "Oh, we have lots of treatments for PTSD, which is complete bullshit. We don't have good effective therapies." And they take years and years and years sometimes. With MDMA, 2 or 3 treatments, and the person is no longer qualified as having PTSD. So, I'm sure there's some resistance, but it's going to be, you're always going to have people that come home at the end of the day and want to sit down and have a couple of beers. and they're not going to, they're happy with that, or go to parties. Big, alcohol is the main and social inebriant. They're always going to have that. It's going to be a smaller population. So I don't know whether the alcohol industry is really concerned about that so much. They're probably just watching what's going on to see if it's going to impact their sales. But I think the more concern with MDMA was that people were taking it instead of drinking alcohol. And you don't take psilocybin instead of drinking alcohol. It
Right.
doesn't work that way. But I mean, it's really interesting just to watch this whole phenomenon develop. I mean, how often do you see a paradigm shift in real time and you watch it go along and see, okay, what's next? Because the states, a lot of state initiatives, North Carolina, where I am, they have a state initiative to generate some funding for a couple of studies, one with MDMA, and I can't remember the other one, maybe psilocybin. And then and I think Texas has a big appropriation for studying psychedelics and treating drug addiction. Um, and what's the drug? They're using the one from that the Witi tribe in Africa has. Drawing a blank on it. I'm 81, but it's kind of more dangerous. You can have some serious cardiac effects with that drug. But Texas, I think, is appropriate like $40 million to study this treatment of addiction. So the states are picking up. The state initiatives are starting to ibogaine. Yeah,
I was
ibogaine.
going to say, I thought it was ibogaine. Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of states are starting state initiatives like Oregon did, California did. They're not waiting for the federal government.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel